actually insane what percentage of conflict that's happening right now literally exists exclusively because of memory of like just the British Empire, let alone the other empires. What we'll tell you is that a lot of war is cyclic, that in many cases where millions of people have died over the last few decades, these are conflicts that the initial inciting incident no longer exists anymore. And the only reason they still perpetuate is because of the lasting memory of the atrocities committed by the other side that perpetuate themselves into the future. We'll explain why you get more lasting peace around the world and why this is generally better. The first is very brief framing. We think the most realistic framing here, given that you still have certain artifacts like guns, for example, that I assume still exist, is that you probably still do have things like the Geneva Convention, the agreements that were created by war. But people, for example, don't know exactly how they came about. They don't remember the underlying reasons, and we don't have actual depictions of the conflicts themselves. I think this is somewhat reasonable. First, constructive. War is cyclical and justifies future war. Generally, it is a much more powerful motivator for war than the countervailing fear of war that might be created by war memory that I think needs to be weighed in this debate. So generally, this looks like a belief about the sort of risk of conflict obligating you to be the first mover advantage. You worry that they're going to attack you because of your memory of what happened in the past. You feel the need to act first. It looks like, for example, revenge as a justification for war. You remember specific atrocities that were committed by a group of people across the border, and you worry that might happen again, or you have such anger that it justifies for further war. This is why, despite the fact that there's like ample knowledge in Gaza that attacking Israel will lead to retaliation that's going to be brutal, this doesn't stop people from doing it because the anger they feel about the past atrocities trumps the sort of relative like knowledge or weighed risk from memory of war that you're going to get retaliation that's bad. I also think that this sort of underlying justification there is important. If you think that if you don't do anything, people are going to retaliate. There's also a lot of atrocities that are specifically justified by this memory and essentially only justified by memory. So there are solutions where like essentially any solution is better than nothing. I think even though it is probably the case that you might believe that, for example, it is unjust if we draw any sort of borders in Palestine because it still represents a theft of huge amounts of land. Assuming that it came with like lasting peace, that's probably better than any other alternative. The problem is that based on a history of mistrust that is backed directly by like the evidence of past encroachments on territory, people are not willing to trust any individual border. So each side like starts conflict with each other, has long-lasting narratives of being distrustful. In a world where we erase these past memories, that lack of trust that is stemmed from specific historical examples dissolves, and people don't really question the nature of the borders as much. They don't see it as that because they don't know about the wars in which they were drafted of being like unfair or whatever, and are much more like comparatively accepting. Take, for example, Crimea and Ukraine, right? Currently, majority Russian-speaking, people generally want to stay within Russia, but the problem is that Ukraine can't really accept this because the way it was taken was somewhat illegitimate, and a lot of people that were Ukrainian were kicked out by the Soviets in order to prevent it from becoming Ukrainian in the future. So here's the double bind that they're now in because people understand this history. If they do nothing, then it sets a precedent that Russia can take their territory, provided that they're able to eradicate the Ukrainian population, replace them with Russians at a sufficient number, and therefore they're fucked because Russia will keep taking the land, which we see status quo. But if they try to do the opposite and invade Crimea and take it over, A, they're unlikely to succeed, but B, in order to succeed, they have to engage in like huge amounts of conflict that displaces the local population, who are likely to engage in like ongoing resistance movements. Perhaps Ukraine either A, feels the need to do the same type of population replacement that displaces like millions of people that Russia did to them, or even if they don't, the Russians who remember doing it themselves probably have fear that will happen to them because they see it like they think the way that their enemy thinks the way that they do, which means that you get massive people willing to engage in lots of violence to prevent this from happening, including preemptive violence to, for example, prevent them from joining NATO by invading the country. However, if we were just to forget history, then you don't have this double bind, right? You can just look the other way. You can say these people are Russian, whatever, it's fine. Even if a lot of them are Ukrainian, minorities being in your country is not that big of a deal if you don't have a memory of those minorities fighting against you and fear that they're likely to do that in the future. And you can accept it without creating a type of precedent that justifies future expansion in the future. I think just think about how many conflicts have a structure very similar to this, right? So, Crimea, for example, but we could also think about Israel and Palestine. We think about Kashmir. We think about Taiwan. All of these have very similar structure, the underlying war happened literally 50 years ago or something. But because of the fact that that you can't give up at any point, even though it might be in everyone's best interest to do that, you have ongoing cyclical conflict. I'll take back up.
Okay, given that the consequences of these things, like economic division, still exist, what do you think people's racial or religious justification will be.
Look, I think it's plausible that people come up with a lot of different justifications that might exist. The problem is that there's some things that are categorically worse. If you have specific memories of people murdering your children in front of you, I think the impetus for, I don't know, compared to like other justifications of inequality are comparatively less persuasive anyways. The other thing I'll say is that I think that like, inequality exists between a lot of countries' status quo, and people don't necessarily see that as like a justification for conflict. Usually you need violence to justify other violence because humans tend to be opposed to the idea of murdering people or committing a lot of atrocities unless they see it as in somewhat like some degree in self-defense, i.e. it's much easier to justify purging a population if you think that they represent an existential threat to you based on past examples of them trying to do similar things to you. And so your memory of what you've done in the past forces you to do that with the opening.
How did the cyclical Israel-Palestine conflict start?
Oh, the British. And this is the beautiful thing, right? Like dividing land arbitrarily. The key thing, right, is the British aren't there anymore, right? Which means that if they were like the underlying inciting event that sparked conflict that now cycles without any clear end in sight, we get to dampen it, and that underlying initial inciting factor isn't there anymore to start it again, right? Which means that we actually have this possibility not just of dampening the conflict in the short term, but creating lasting peace because it's unclear that the British Empire is going to come back and draw another arbitrary border. So I think what this ultimately means is that, and I think you know, there's sort of some nuance there as well, but I think the key thing is that you're able to get some. Lastly, I think knowledge doesn't prevent it due to a lot of vested interest. So like a lot of people, either A, even if they know that certain actions are to cause conflict, don't necessarily care, or B, it's like unclear given that you could still speculate about things like mutually assured destruction with the same degree of emotional fear. I also think that in terms of just like memory of war is kind of like, but even if learned tactics, for example, can be reestablished, but in a time where everyone loses their knowledge of war tactics, everyone's sort of similarly disadvantaged. It's unlikely that any country has an advantage. And probably in the long term, people relearn these things and approximate a world that's similar to the one that we live in. At minimum, though, you take away something that is unique in human history, like imperialism that started a lot of wars, and dampen a lot of conflict in the short term, which is probably very good. I think at best, maybe they argue that the uncertainty that results from not knowing about sort of degree of war and what war might look like looks like people going to war when they shouldn't. So, for example, people in World War I not realizing how bad the war would be, and therefore like choosing to engage in conflict that might not have been in their strategic interest. And maybe they argue that like we can deal with this somehow, but with memory. The problem is that A, this isn't particularly solved in the status quo because we still have tons of sources of uncertainty from the fact that, for example, technology is changing, so our past knowledge of war doesn't necessarily accurately reflect like what war is going to look like in the future. But also the fact that it can go both ways. So, for example, people might overestimate how bad war is going to be in the future because intuitively, like being potentially murdered is scary. So maybe this also prevents war because people don't see this as bad. And without the narrativizing that happens uniquely from the art and propaganda that says war is good, perhaps it's a better thing.
So much for that wonderful piece. I call on second speaker of open.
Speaker, press the button, and the greatest works in human history, monuments to the endurance of people in spite of unimaginable horror, paintings labored over as bombs exploded overhead, are washed away in a river of blood. Blood poisoned with the unhealed trauma of generations who ate from wounds they cannot see. What opposition must defend is the death of history, and this is something that we think is unconscionable. I want you to know what opposition has to weigh against. First, a generation of people who cannot understand their own lives. Your aunt was killed in a war. Where is she? How did she die? You lost your home where you grew up. Where did it go? You lost your childhood friends. Where were they? How do you make sense of your life without these things that shape it? And I think even in the cases where impacts are not as proximate as this, how do you understand the story of your people as being forced out of their land? How do you understand that the mountains that you see when you wake up every morning are not the same ones that your grandparents did? That this self-actualization is the most critical thing to people's understandings of themselves. It's why they start wars to begin with, so that they can claim land that they rightfully feel is theirs, so that they can defend people who they love and care about, so that they can avenge their losses. And opposition causes those losses to happen without explanation to billions of people, even if they are able to prove that this causes more conflict, Those children who do not know and will never know where their parents are greatly away. I think this will probably be back half too. I'll take a closer.
Would you burn the painting of Guernica, which depicts war, if it saved 10 people's lives?
We do not think it will save people's lives. We think it will make people not understand their lives as well. This was a waste of a people. The second thing that they have to deal with, the start of new conflicts without the knowledge of the history that precedes them. Perhaps the physical papers of the Geneva Convention will still exist, but they are just that without the images of the unimaginable suffering of the Second World War. That what prevents the worst people in the world from unleashing the full extent of that evil is the knowledge that the legacies of despots past will forever be scarlet with shame. I really like that alliteration. And so perhaps it's the case that you still have legal precedent. We don't know if that's true enough. But I think without the historical precedent of knowing that the legacies of tyrants are ruined, without knowing that when you bomb civilians, it is decades, generations of people who suffer afterward, I think that actually most people in the world are not gravely evil, that they are good, that they don't want to hurt people. And so to the extent that it is, that they are able to realize the effects of conflict, we think that this prevents a lot of these really grave harms. And I think that it also shows the consequences of violent thought. That perhaps your country thinks that they can benefit by violencing others. But when they see the grave costs of war, not only the cost of suffering themselves, sending their children off to fight and die, but also seeing the children of others who they realize through the conflict are very similar to them die as well. I think to the extent that they experience these things, they want to solve these future conflicts, not with war, but with words. I'll take opening.
So there's a lot of people that like don't have legs, for example, but the ones that have specific memories of having it knocked off by a child soldier or whatever probably have more recurring trauma in their lives and are worse off as a direct result of those memories compared to people that don't have those recollections or maybe lost it as a child.
No, I think this is very intellectually lazy, and I think there's a couple of responses to that. I think the first is this is like an incredibly specific case that like probably isn't always true. I think the second, though, is that actually I think it's much easier to process trauma that you at least have a recollection. Yes, it is very shitty and upsetting to have to deal with the fact that your leg was hacked off. But if you have a missing leg and your family has missing members and your house doesn't exist anymore, it's not as though you can just be like, oh, well, who knows how that happened, moving on, right? Clearly, there's a problem that you just can't catch. And I think, like, when you think about kids who suffer trauma when they're very young, too young to remember it, who can never solve it, that is some of the most complex post-traumatic stress disorder that the medical system really struggles to address. I think the last principle here, and maybe I'll take the POI later, is the destruction of humanity's great works. You press the button and there is an empty plinth where Trajan's column once stood. That all of the art painted for war to commemorate its brutality and its beauty ceases to exist. We think that these works that show generations of humans, even those not affected by conflict, the ingenuity and the power of the human spirit, the history of their people, are a principle that opposition has to deal with. I want to give you some direct responses. I will take opening first.
So I don't understand why you assume that everyone deals with trauma in these healthy and productive ways instead of becoming angry, resentful, and violent, which happens historically very frequently.
So I think it's symmetric, right? But it's worse on your side. Because if you deal with trauma poorly, then yes, you deal with trauma poorly if you know about it. If you deal with trauma poorly, but you don't know what that trauma is, I think the ways that you do that are probably much more destructive and worse because you have, like, you can't get therapy if you don't know what you were going to tell your therapist. And so I think you do worse things. I think it's symmetric. I'll take CO for 4 POIs. Yeah.
Yeah, so presumably, like, war art is beautiful and good, but art never outweighs the value of human life. So this principle is incapable of winning around unless you actually prove you get less conflict.
Sure, 2 things. First, I'm about to do that. Second, I think that human life only matters so long as it is a quality one that is self-actualized, one where people feel as though they have agency. If you do not know your own history, this cannot happen. We think it is better to be dead than not know why it is that your life is the way it is. Okay, now I'm responding to OO. They say war is cyclic, revenge is the justification for war that people are going to try and take the first mover advantage. We think this is actually incredibly marginal. I think as our backup points out in the POI, of course it's true that people invade each other because they want money and power, that it is that Russia invades Ukraine because they want to take their natural resources. These are not things that will go away. Perhaps there is a small marginal benefit that like, you invade more slowly because it is that you no longer want revenge. I think this is very clearly outweighed. But I think they also, like maybe a better response is just that humans are opposed to atrocities. I think what pushes people into war far more often is not that they hate others, but that they don't know the consequences of what it is that they do. When we create those consequences, I think we reduce the political appetite for war. I want to flip this. On the historical consequences of conflict, perhaps there is more conflict, but we think there are less destructive tactics when the Geneva Convention now either exists or has weight. We think this probably outweighs. And I think secondly, when people are pushed into conflict by trauma, as we agree is true, you probably get pushed into conflict more by trauma that you can't process, right? If you don't understand where there are a bunch of people who look like you in your country, you don't know why they got there, you don't know that it is your fault that they were pushed there from where they originally lived, I think you're much more likely to hurt them than if you know why they were there, if you feel guilty for putting them that way. I think this is a clean OG win. It's very proud to propose. And thank you very much to Leela for a wonderful tournament, for all of you for organizing it, and for closing government if you not understand it.
Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you. My amazing partner, Jacob, for the first time. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm going to be starting in 3. Opening government wishes that we learned from our lessons, that we'd stop conflict just because we saw it before. But the reality is, war never changes. We engage in these cycles perpetually despite knowing the consequences that lead to. It is an inevitability of the human condition that we can at least prevent for a little bit, and that is a delta that we provide in our set house. I'm going to take down their case and I'll reveal ours, then weighing it. What do we hear on opening government? The first thing we hear is that if we do not remember war crimes or all these bad things, then we're likely to engage in very bad kinds of violence. The problem with their case is that this motion doesn't suggest that we forget all violence. It just suggests we forget like large-scale violence. So there's still some approximate understanding of attacking somebody is bad and makes them feel bad and it hurts and all these other things. We still have the remnants of these documents to suggest the kinds of things that could be bad for reasons that are quite logical. So to that extent, war being worse is probably not something that exists, because either way, a soldier does not go repeatedly multiple conflicts. They go the first time. So types of actions that they might engage in the heat of the moment does not change on either type of side. So that to that extent does not exist. The second thing I think is well responded by Jacob's already about the frameworks that probably exist independently. So I think that justifies our case further. The next thing that they say is that there is likely to be this type of PTSD that you're unlikely to forget. And I note that this is probably where they hinge most of their case rhetorically based on how much time that they spent. I want to note something very, very important. And that is, despite, yes, the fact that individuals might not necessarily remember certain things, for one, I want to point out that this says memory, and I think that includes muscle memories. I think that this is broadly something that's applicable. Even if they don't suggest that this is applicable, then what I do suggest is that people self-compartmentalize all the time. That is, people want to justify their own traumas in ways that make sense to them. When they have someone to pin it on, like for example, I broke my leg, then I justify it by pushing it onto them. But when I don't have someone clear to blame it on, then I'm likely to rationalize my type of trauma in a way that allows me to move on. This is why, for example, I could break up with a partner, have them break up with me, but it does not perpetually justify my existence. So to that extent, I think that you're able to get moved past this. You're able to forget the muscle memories. You're able to move on from this and maybe get some kind of therapy to get away from it. But what you can't forget is that constant memory, that constant conflict, the fact that your mother did die because of this other individual. It is much easier to come to peace and terms with knowing that there's an uncertainty, an eventuality that you cannot explain that was the cause of your suffering, rather than knowing the direct cause and having a cause of belly, a cause of action, a deep hatred toward this person that caused it to you or to you. I think the weighing is quite clear. The suffering you can cause on to yourself from remembering these actions is far worse than not understanding where the types of problems have came from. The last thing that they talked about is that why would you want to you're gonna have new conflicts without understanding what happened before, and therefore you're more likely to get into new conflicts. Basically, past conflict informs us in order to make sure we don't get into new conflict. My first response is that war actions that are in the past are not proximate to you. That is, for example, yes, I know that, for example, there was some kind of civil war maybe like 100 years ago, but that's not the current case right now, which means I have no concept of whether this should be something to make a decision on. But secondly, more importantly, they ignore how war starts. And war starts as a result of these types of emotions and feelings of retribution. That is, it is inherently not a rational action. It is something that is conducive to the fact that you yourself have emotional memories and connections, and that makes you work towards violence. It comes from the heat of the moment like any other crime or violence or act of violence. It's the fact that my partner said something mean to me, and then in an act of retaliation, I might be a terrible person and might hit them back. This is the reality of violence and war, and it's why people never learn. It is why we've had so many millions of people die, we never learn from it. If you want to believe in hedge their case on the fact that we solve war, that is a ridiculous proposition. I don't think they say that. Opening government is gone. I'm now going to continue on to our case. Firstly, I want to characterize the nature of large-scale conflict. One, conflict is often not resolved in a neat fashion for two reasons. The first one is that even if there was an initial wrong that occurred, it is likely that both sides engage in some kind of violence that both sides can hinge their dependency on. For example, Ukraine has done bad things to Russia. People died, but we know Russia is the aggressor. The second thing is majority groups have no interest in conceding wrongs, as it invokes bad feelings and negates the benefits they get from rallying around a national identity formed by conflict. Minority groups don't have the capacity to pressure. Ultimately, what this necessarily means is that conflict occurs, but it's often unresolved and leads to this perpetual state of violence. But it also means that reparations that opening government suggests they could get is highly improbable. We could certainly guarantee in our side of the house to get rid of another cause of belly, cause of action. In fact, I think we get better reparations, because if there's a broken building that exists that you don't know why it's broken, it's not because of a conflict, then you're likely to say this person, as a human being, I understand that buildings matter, that they should have a house. I will build a building in Palestine. But what they will have on their side of the house is that this person killed my mother, and I will never build any buildings for that type of person. We get better, not reparations, but better restructuring of conflict that exists right now. I'll take the PY.
The IRA fought the UK for multiple decades, and now they're pretty chill. If war is truly cyclical, why was the Good Friday Agreement signed? It's because they saw the consequences of violence and realized it wasn't worth it.
No, it's actually because of the mechanisms that I was actually about to get to on our side. Why does our side reduce conflict? For two reasons. The first is we have to note that this notion exists right now. That is, we live in a contemporary state of interconnectedness that does not change on either side of the house, which means absent of these negative emotions that exist with the large-scale conflicts that have happened in the past, you still remember some of the good things. For example, I as a Palestinian person might have bought something that is Israeli. I remember that absent of the conflict that existed, which means now I'm able to form better conceptions of the relations of individuals. It's ultimately interconnectedness in the economics of right now that allows us, because if we were to say what the price is bought 1,000 years ago, it wouldn't matter. There'd be no delta. But right now, there is a delta because of the fact that we have the perfect conditions to breed peace in order to make sure that people have the proper relationships, that they're not willing to do irrational acts. It's on their side where we get irrationality. It's on their side where, like, yes, we have economic interdependence, like we had suggested by closing, but we violate that because violence is something that's emotional, and we take these violent acts out of retribution, not because of any reason. Yes.
Do you think that the population, government, and court support for the hundreds of billions of dollars of First Nations funding would occur if we didn't remember what we did to fuck them over in the first place?
I think that we could possibly have it, but I honestly think at the end of the day, I probably weigh the fact intergenerational trauma for Indigenous people is probably way worse and makes them individually get in cycles of their own violence, get into, for example, bad states of mind and not be able to, for example, move on, not to their own fault. I don't blame them, but this is something that is a reality. We'd rather solve this problem than not exist. I'm going to do last things. One, why does memory make you feel bad about yourself? It's hard to move on to conflict because survival is our primal instinct, and that puts us at jeopardy when we have so much stress and we lose people in violence. We have constant reminders of the house because of our own perceptions, but also because of memorials, because of constant retribution, which means you have thousands and millions of people constant in daily stress. This affects your quality of living. This makes it incapable of you to actually move on and engage with yourself. I want to do some final way. Firstly, conflict exists in both sides of the house. They get worse conflict, and yes, conflict might exist for resources, but we get rid of one big reason that happens because of conflict independently, which means now we're able to get rid of it. And the base case that we have is very important. And that is, we are less likely to have violence. Even if we do, we'd rather irreversibly get rid of the violence and not, and lastly, a base way, we'd rather at least provide some people some kind of mental solvency that not.
Thank you for that wonderful speech. I call on the speaker of CG.
Between 1884 and 1885, the Berlin West Africa Conference carved up the entirety of Africa between the British, the French, the Germans, and the Belgians. Many of these borders and the ensuing conflicts still exist today, but in ops world, no one knows why. I think this is massively damaging. I think it's going to lead to massive amounts of inequality. I think it's going to lead to racism and other types of discrimination being perpetuated, and people coming up with horrible justifications for why it is that they have the endowment they have, because they do not know about the history of conquest that led to them. And I think that the only art that you have remaining is going to be that which is made by the most privileged people in society, and that's extremely damaging. I'm going to do two things for you in my sentence. First, I'm going to talk about the importance of inequality that emerged, and second, I'm going to talk about what remains and why it's bad. First, on inequalities. I think OG generally talks about why it is that you need to learn from your mistakes. You need to learn, for example, the true horrors of genocide by seeing that you've done it and that it's really bad. But what we're going to do for you on closing is twofold. First, we're going to explain what types of narratives it is that people create in order to justify the fact that things are endowed the way that they are. And second, we're going to explain on the comparative, i.e. in ops world, why it is that you don't have things, you don't have these types of mechanisms developing. Basically, what we're going to tell you is that, for example, you have the legacy of all the border conflicts from the partition of Africa. You have the fact that the Tutsi population in Rwanda is decimated, but you don't have any context for why that happened, and that's very bad. The problem is that these conflicts are settled right now, and they will become unsettled in ops world, and for that reason, proud to oppose. First argument, or first, why is it that you have more settled, why is it that you have these bad justifications being thought of? The basic fact is just that the legacy of many conflicts means that there are very wealthy people and very poor people, right? Like colonial powers and states have immense amounts of wealth. They have higher GDP per capita. They generally have better job opportunities. They have better healthcare. They have massive advantages because of the history of conquest that they've engaged in. But because no one knows why, I think people invent narratives to justify why things are the way that they are. I think privileged people think that they are the superior or the level of moral desert that means that they deserve to have these things because they don't know why it is they have them. They don't think that they acquired them through illegitimate means. They don't know about the bloody history. They come up with reasons to justify the fact that they have the things that they do. I'll explain more on this when I get to the comparative, but I think this is a massive problem. The second is I think that there's just a much greater risk of violent uprising. So, you know, Tutsis in Rwanda look at Burundi and they see that because it's not as bad there, it is in their own country, they decide to start their own revolution violently because they don't know about the consequences of the genocide, for example. I think you just get more people restarting conflicts that have previously been settled because they don't know about the history that's led to them, and they don't know that violence doesn't work in these cases and that it's been tried already. But I think there's also a lot of different social structures that further entrench these things. For example, look to religion, right? Many people will probably read the Bible and think that it justifies that, you know, they're more deserving of the things they have because they worship God, and then buy into these narratives even more further. But I think on the comparative, things are going to be better when you do not press the button, and you're going to have, you know, less of these types of discriminatory narratives that people actually buy into, more efforts for like redistribution and reconciliation, et cetera. Why is that? First is that if you have any degree of privilege, you know to some extent about the sordid past that led to it accruing. So you know that your ancestors engaged in theft. And even if there may be off wants to say that there are reasons why it is that you think that they were justified in this, or that they like won the war because they were stronger, the margin on our side is still that they had to kill someone to get those things, right? It's that there was bloody things associated with it they probably think are morally wrong, i.e. theft. And so they're still going to believe that they have some obligation to engage in things like redistribution because you know that there was some sort of level involved versus on off knowing absolutely nothing. But I think second, you can blame the British Empire rather than blaming your neighbor, for example, which is actually a huge, huge impact, right? Because you have this prevents people from having things like border skirmishes to as much of a degree as they would have on off, or having the degree of conflict they would otherwise have with their neighbors because they can blame it on the third party that led to things being the way that they currently are. And I also want to note that shared history is also a good binding tool that we have uniquely on our side, i.e. the shared history of conflict, because it allows you to actually lobby better with people who are from your shared community. You have that thing in common. So these people are more actually able to advocate for change. But finally, I think that the fact that it is simply settled means that you know that violence doesn't work and you're just less likely to try it again. The impact of this is that on gov or on ops world, you have things like more racism and more elitism, and people believe that things are justified for being the way that they are. You have much less willingness for efforts toward redistribution, reconciliation, et cetera, opening.
So generally, given the polarization and conflict, it's rare that even the more powerful people feel guilt versus just saying that it's justified. So Israelis don't really believe that they stole it, or to the extent they do, they say it's justified
justified because otherwise they'd be killed.
Many people already feel guilt today. Like, I think lots of Canadians probably feel some degree of guilt over the way that Indigenous people were treated. Like, panel, you probably feel this. I don't know, I do. Clothing.
Yeah, so Tutsi militants are currently fighting guerrilla wars in Eastern Congo. How can you ever have reparations while these conflicts continue to occur?
I mean, I think the point is that, like, on your side, there is absolutely no historical context. The point is you have even more things occurring because you don't know why things are the way that they are. Like, I think this is not comparative from that. Second, then I want to talk about what remains and why it is that it's so bad. The only art that you have left is things that is made by elites and people who are privileged enough to sit in an ivory tower waxing poetic about dumb bullshit while people were defending their lives outside. And I think that this is really bad. I think, first of all, it's because you end up with narratives of superiority without the evidence of bloodshed that accompanied them. So you might have the work that initially explained why it is that white people are somehow superior to other races, but you don't actually have any of the context to see what the conflicts that emerged as a result of that were. So you don't understand why those things were bad to the same extent. But second, I think you have this massive stereotype that emerges that art is only for elites, that disprivileged people don't do it well, because there's very, very little of it that's made by those people on their side, because those are the people who often were involved in the conflicts, right? The least privileged people are probably that way because of the result of conflicts that have emerged in the past. And I think that this means that there are stereotypes that mean that galleries, for example, like, don't want art made by people who come from less privileged backgrounds because there's no historical evidence that it was any good because it doesn't exist when you press the button. Publishers won't read these books, etc. The impact, I think, is that you lose out on a lot of the empathy building capacity of art because you don't have things like the Diary of Anne Frank in their world. But I think you also have less art made for non-elites to enjoy, and you have stereotypes that say that minorities can't be artists, they can't be authors, their work is simply not as valuable. I think the margin on this is very, very significant. For those reasons, incredibly proud of the title.
So that's.
Right after the button is pressed, humanity wakes up to a world where war still exists, a world where conflict is still happening, and a world where they're able to look for the first time with fresh eyes to see the horror that is present. Something that has been missing from this debate thus far is that this makes you forget about past conflict. It does not make you forget about the conflict which is presently happening. It does not make you forget about the disputes and wars that are killing the minorities that Gov wants to talk about in status quo. This does not make you forget about Israel-Palestine. It does not make you forget against Ukraine-Russia. What this motion does allow you to do is to not contextualize these horrors in the past of previous conflicts and to relegate them to a world where you are desensitized. It allows you to look at these conflicts as the horrific conflicts that they are. I think this is why this round is so important. First, on a frame. Present conflicts still exist. This is within the round of the motion. And I want to point out that given the analysis from the Gov bench, where they're talking about the fear of future conflicts coming up, it is highly plausible that in all of these cases, there are present conflicts happening. The war and the conflict with the Tutsis did not disappear. The Tutsis are fighting guerrilla wars in Eastern Congo. It is impossible to seek reparation at the point at which they are presently involved in conflicts. Read the info slide for this motion. Second, present inequality. I think OFF is deeply uncharitable at the point at which they say that the cause catalyst of conflict is past conflict and the memory of that. I'm sorry, but after this motion happens, it doesn't mean that Palestinians, A, aren't involved in a present conflict, but B, aren't living under apartheid. I mean, the Tuareg in Mali are still living in slums in their cities. The actual catalyst for conflicts persist. We think there's no resolution to this. Finally, institutions exist, but they are flawed. I think institutions that resolve conflict emerged at a time in which war looked very different, in which war was between two belligerent parties, and those parties came and signed a peace agreement. We think those no longer reflect the state of conflicts in the world today. There are no institutions to resolve things like non-state actors with militant groups, with ethnic groups, and to resolve those conflicts. The case we're going to give you is very simple. One, what are the mechanisms to solve present conflict? Note that Gov was very charitable, and they think that people seeing bombs dropped on Gaza stops them wars from happening. I'm sorry, but that is the world I would love to live in, but that is not the world we live in, and the characterization from Gov is absurd on its face when you have to look at the state of the world today for their capacity to solve conflict. But two, we're going to talk to you why we have more willingness and institutional support to stop future conflict, which is the most important mention in this debate. Because no, the Gov bench tells you that we care about art and I care about identity. I am sorry, but I would throw the entirety of the human artistic canon in the garbage if it saved 10,000 people's lives. I would say that if we care about trauma, trauma of people right now matters, but the trauma of millions of people into the future matters more. I think there is no engagement with this round. Actually, given that, any POIs from the Gov bench?
Yeah, the narrative that Hamas started the war on October 7th, completely out of context, is the reason why so many people are comfortable with the bombing of Gaza in the first place. I feel like when you remove the historical context for why people do things, that is not the sleigh that you think it is.
Yeah, I think the important thing to note, and I'm going to get into my first case here, is that people have an innate emotive response. I think there is something uniquely horrible about war. There is something uniquely horrible about the famine and atrocity that it suffers. I think there is a context in which looking at war with fresh eyes, with no contextualization of the past, with no desensitization, means that the true horrors of war actually allow you to act on that, actually allow you to actualize the empathy that the Gov bench wants to talk about, which is incapable of accessing on their side. How do we solve present conflict? Perception of the horror of war. One, no desensitization from past conflict. They tell you people are innately empathetic. I tell you that is overridden by the fact that empirically, most people look at scenes of war and they think of movies, they think of art they've seen, they think of other conflicts and say it's not as bad as it was, or this is just how the world is and there's nothing we can do about it. At the point in which we have no memory, this is a unique horror. Two, there is more public interest. I think people don't actually seek out those images because there's not novel, it is not a unique thing. At the point in which I wake up in the morning and I have never seen war before, I have never seen a desiccated corpse, this is my first time seeing it, the public is more likely to seek that out. Third, you have a fear and uncertainty of the future. You have never seen a war before. You don't know how Ukraine-Russia is going to spiral. There's a fear that this could go horrendously wrong, and you have no idea what this potentially could lead to. So there is an impetus for you to act in terms of resolving those conflicts in that case. Back half.
People who had no previous beef with Africa still justified the slave trade based on the fact that it was advantaging them, and then said that the racial division divided it. Why wouldn't you just have similar things in the ongoing conflicts you're talking about?
I think presumably it is because there is a unique horror to war that is overridden by the human empathetic instinct. You assert that people will construct these narratives without giving a reason to it. I think it is deeply unclear to me why people need to invent a supremacy narrative over the Tutsis when there is no need to contextualize that within the previous war, and when that justifies ongoing atrocities that is horrendous to them. You assert this, there is no mechanism as to why this is likely to happen. What then happens? There is immense political pressure from the people to end these wars. In status quo, there is not enough public pressure to end Israel-Gaza, to end Russia-Ukraine. You're likely to get the democratic will, which imposes people to actually end these conflicts once and for all. Second, the fear and uncertainty imposed on states means that states are willing to end these wars, and there is immense external pressure because they do not know, based on lack of contextual information, whether these current conflicts are going to affect them. There is immense incentive to resolve the wars in this context. What this leads then is you also have a immense swift action to resolve conflicts, prevent future deaths, and you resolve these conflicts in effective ways because the problem conflicts are resolved in status quo is because people are not willing to make enough concessions at the point at which now you have more willingness on the part of people and states. You're more likely to make the underground concessions which actually prevent future conflict in the long term. Second, preventing future conflict. Why are conflicts sinkable? It's not just war, but it's because the underlying equality in and of itself never gets resolved. We think that we actually solve this at the point at which states, when they come to peace agreements, don't come to adequate concessions. We give you the actual mech to link while you actually get the political will to access those political concessions and therefore resolve those conflicts, importantly, ending inequality in these contexts. Second, there's more motivation to end the horror, given the lack of desensitization and decontextualization of the horrors you're seeing. You want to put an end to these. But second, the institutions get better. We tell you that these institutions are structurally flawed in that they are designed to address conflicts which no longer happen. We are likely to modernize those institutions to address non-state actors, and we have the political will to do it for the mechanisms I give you in the first argument, which means you have a greater capacity to end these conflicts. I think secondly, you're likely to learn from present lessons rather than past lessons, which means your resolutions are a lot less likely to look like Libya, and they're more likely to look like actual lasting pieces. For this debate, because we end atrocity, we end horror, because we end war, we are so proud to oppose.
Thank you. For the wonderful speech. I call on government with.
History may have been written by the victors, but the stories and legacies of the oppressed are starting to seep through into collective consciousness. This is the place that we are in, and is the place that Sarenna and I think is the most likely to lead to lasting peace. First, for the conflicts that may be ongoing, that we don't want to continue or escalate, but probably more impactfully for all of the conflicts that are more or less resolved, that are in places of relative stability, where lots need to be done to address the inequality in those societies and ensure that future conflict does not arise. I think the issue that I have with opening government is that they tell us that in absence of an understanding of the real consequences of war, you aren't going to necessarily understand why you need to prevent that war or like not fall into it again. But I think Op does have a point that that's probably still quite mitigated by the fact that you probably still have less kind of visceral reactions to people that might stop you from going to war. I think Sarenna breaks this clash by explaining why, one, the information you have left in your memories and in your writing are likely to bias you in a particular direction that's actually going to be way more harmful to your understanding of the other people, or like the opposing side. And I think she's also able to explain why this is going to undermine your ability to try to move on from conflicts that exist. So first, let's talk about trauma. I'm going to kind of try to clear this pretty quickly. So OG says, in absence of understanding where your trauma comes from, you feel absence and you like can't self-actualize, like it's better to be. OO says like you're going to have less traumatic memories because at least you don't remember your leg being blown off, or you don't remember somebody doing it to you. I think the thing is, I still think you feel a lot of the impacts of these, but Sarenna brings it further than the individual impact, right? We talk about things like the lack of education from the fact that you were oppressed during this war, or that you were subjugated because of this war, alcoholism, or like abuse that might run in your family that will still occur after that thing, but that you have no explanation for. Why does this matter? One, for your understanding of yourself. It's not like a philosophical, like you can't self-actualize, right? It's like not blaming just yourself and your family for the things that are happening, having the like British Empire to point to, I think is really better for collective consciousness, but also policy-wise, right? When you live in societies post-conflict or that are coming out of conflict that understand that the blame shouldn't be squarely on the oppressed, that is when they're willing to implement policies that help these people like rise up from the consequences of those things. That's why there have literally been hundreds of billions of dollars pumped into helping uplift Indigenous people in our society that are only justified in the courts based off the legacy of colonialism, right? Brett Half.
Okay, so for every good reparations you get, like Canada and their indigenous people, which are often symbolic and half-assed, you get worse bad reparations, like those forced on Germany after World War I, that led to millions of deaths in World War II, that are often justified because if you just won an armed conflict and had all the narratives to justify it, you're not going to feel guilty after.
Okay, so this is great, right? Because you can learn from the consequences of the bad reparations and not do those again, right? So you know that post-World War I, what you did to Germany led to World War II, so you don't do it again. That's fine. Okay, OG though says like, so yeah, I think we just expand this, right? Because we say this is much longer. This is about reparations and ongoing support, right? I think this happens in a lot of countries where people at least feel some level of guilt or externality. The other mechanism here though is like, guys, your memory of war and conflict gets wiped, so does the art. But what books are left, right? What memories are left, right? The books and memories that are left are still writings about these same people, right? The Rye, for example, like white people in Britain talking about how like uneducated and how unhuman indigenous people are, right? You still get a lot of those writings that justify the intervention, but you don't get the intervention that happened. So I still think you get the art and memories that justifies opinions of people that creates that disparity, right? You still get writings that talk about the racial disparities between individuals. So those things are still in people's minds and memories. They just don't understand that the consequence of having those opinions is that conflict that is new and did not come out of back half.
Yeah, so presumably cultures have songs, paintings, they talk about the repression and subjugation. The only doubt in this round is about war. We think Black people have been writing about discrimination forever, and this is likely to be part of it today.
Yeah, but the problem is usually when people write about their own discrimination, they contextualize it in the war or conflict that occurred. The elites are less likely to do that, right? Because they don't want to think that they're engaging in the same type of war or conflict, because they had to preemptively justify those things in other ways. And even if you have some writing that writes about your own individual oppression in a way that is decontextualized from war, it's still bad, right? Because you might still read those writings and think, okay, well, it still justifies it because I'm inferior in X or Y, Z, right? I have consequences and legacies of colonialism, such as alcoholism, that make me an inferior person. You're more likely to believe that. You also have less communities like rising up together, right? Because you don't have that same shared identity and feeling. So I just think you as a lobbying group are worse off. Okay, how do we stop current war? And this is where I'm going to engage with CO. Okay, first of all, you should have a point of clarification if you wanted to make this like the ongoing conflicts don't apply. Like, sorry, Brett Half. But second of all, if you wipe away the context, I think it just gets so much worse. What's their justification, right? They say the core to war overrides empathy. But if you don't have history, then you're going to get like the political will, etc., to overcome that. I actually think it's the opposite, right? So what happens is, if you realize in the middle of war that you no longer have a memory of why you're doing the thing, but you're like in the middle of killing someone, right? Or you're in the middle of like a one-on-one division, I think that's where you actually need to justify to yourself that it is justified. That's why my slavery POI is so relevant, right? Because if you realize that the division is happening in Gaza and these people are oppressed, you have to tell yourself, my family, my people who I still identify with because of my text did this for a reason. I actually think that this solidifies in your mind that disparity between groups, and it gets worse. Future conflicts. Sarenna just killed this. Good job, girl. Okay, first of all, it just gets so much worse because you're justifying ongoing conflicts that don't exist. I think there are a few things Sarenna asked, right? One, you don't know what worked and what didn't. Two, you can't, even if, as the OO says, you have like a fear of retaliation. That means that you might be likely to act or react in a certain way. You don't have the memory of one, external interventions that would reduce that, right? If you don't trust that the US will say come to your aid or that external actors will intervene in certain places, you probably feel more likely to act on the racial like feelings that you still have, even if you don't have the context of war, because you don't actually know that the West will intervene, for example, or someone will. Two, the circumstances leading to that still occur, right? You still have individual memories of racial divisions or opinions, so you intervene based off those beliefs, but you have nothing to counteract and tell you why that was a bad idea overall. So proud. This is probably actually my last year. So thank you for bringing me back after what I really thought was my retirement. I literally wouldn't have done it for anyone other than you. Sorry, Anders. So I really appreciate it. I had a lot of fun and
That's crazy. Quick thank yous to Rhys. He's a really, really good debater. Yeah. I'll call for good. Well, this is a debate about the memory of past conflicts. Past conflicts are not the same as present conflicts. Words have meaning, even if the top half doesn't know how words work. And in response to the whip, obviously, this isn't about losing the memory of the first half of the war, like halfway into the war, and forgetting who you shot at yesterday. That's patently implausible. Great, let's go team by team, starting with OG. They say there's 7 main things I want to discuss. First, they said that you lose conflict prevention systems like the ICJ. OO is right, the current conflict prevention systems that exist in the status quo are going to exist in both sides. But what OO misses here is that pressing the button will improve the current conflict prevention system, which is necessary because Rhys explained to you uniquely why it is that these current systems are failing. See Ukraine, see Israel. I'll expand later on how we actually fix them. Second thing from OG is trauma. I think the top half is a wash. They identified there's one form of trauma. They identified there's another more concrete form of trauma. I don't really know who wins. Third is seeking reparations. One, this very rarely is effective. People very rarely, when they request reparations, actually get them. But also this is just a wash against OO saying instead you might seek revenge. We'll explain the deadlock breakers later. Fourth is art. In addition to all of Rhys's POIs, just make different art, bro. I'm sorry, this hits CG as well. Fifth is tech. There's many other reasons for doing AI research. I'm really unclear why it is that memories of past conflicts are the tipping point here. Sixth, they said that you lose an understanding of your culture and history. Gut check. Most people would choose partial amnesia over death. Obviously, if we win on the conflict class, we take it over any understanding of culture and history. Death deprives you of all understanding and all memories. Clearly, it matters more. Note also, wars oftentimes come with the killing of cultures, genocides, etc. Seventh, they said you lose knowledge of conflicts, and this knowledge is super, super key. We explained to you uniquely why it is that given our framing that I began with at the top half of my speech, why we get the knowledge that they talk about via the current conflict still existing. And we actually get more knowledge that is enacted in terms of how we solve conflicts far more in ICERN when everyone is paying attention to the conflict, when everyone is trying to learn from the conflict, because the first time a large-scale conflict has, in your mind, ever happened in the entire history of humanity. For the thousands of years in which humanity has been on this planet, you believe this is the very first time the large-scale conflicts have happened. So you pay attention. You try to learn from them. In the status quo, people are desensitized. People tune it out. They don't learn any lessons. Gut check this. At the beginning of every alien invasion movie, the aliens invade and all of humanity bands together because this is the first time we've ever faced an existential threat like this. We put aside our differences. We call up the White House, whatever. That's the exact same thing that is going to happen in Ops world. Yes.
On that. Okay, so if you think you're literally attacking aliens because the only writing you have left says those aliens are inferior, obviously it justifies that conflict even more when you don't know what the past repercussions were.
I'll respond to this stuff on justifications later. I don't really think that who has better or worse normative justifications and who can appeal to specific writings or not actually ends up manifesting that much in terms of who gets shot at the end of the day. I think the linked work is very tenuous in your case. Okay, yeah.
October 7th and 3 minutes ago are both in the past. So massacres and airstrikes that happened at those times are, in fact, past conflicts.
In your absolute best case, if you're right, that people are literally going to forget about what happened yesterday, then I think what we get is even more of humanity reacting extremely to this. Because now we not only see large-scale conflicts happening for the first time ever, but also large-scale conflicts literally emerging out of the ether and being created without even any sort of previous history leading up to them. We just get massive scale cognitive dissonance, probably absolutely even more terrified. All the horror and impacts that Rhys identifies are magnified. I think we need some charitability here. Clearly the past is the past, but I think we should probably draw the line somewhere reasonably to say that present conflicts are different. I don't know exactly where the line is drawn. It has to be drawn somewhere. Okay, let's talk OO. They say cycles of revenge. Two main things to say. First, as OG says, there are many, many other sources of conflicts. Pressing the button won't change whether Palestinians live in an apartheid state and thus hate Israel. So what matters more is how outside systems can stop and prevent large-scale conflicts rather than the impetus for creating large-scale conflicts between groups. Second response, OO never actually explained why it is that current large-scale conflicts, which will continue to exist on both sides, won't just kick off new cycles of revenge, thus accruing all these harms that they outlined to you. Their case is at best fundamentally short-termist. Our case applies into the long term. Great, let's talk CG then. 3 main things I want to say for CG. First, they say indigenous reconciliation is a thing. Check this. Very, very few countries do
meaningful Indigenous reconciliation, they say Canada over and over again. But one, Canada is the exception, not the rule. Two, Indigenous communities still don't have clean drinking water in Canada. I'm sorry, I don't know how big the impacts are on your side. Thus, I do not know what the Delta U is here at all. Second thing they say is, well, you get bad justifications for why you have what you have in ops world. Three responses. First, the justifications are often equally bad on your side as well. You can say, well, we beat you in the war because we are stronger than you, we are better than you, we are in God's grace, and that's why we won the war. You remember the war, it doesn't solve that justification problem. Sarenna responds flippantly by saying, well, you feel guilty. We flip this. We explain to you why there's more guilt on ops when there's current conflicts that you aren't desensitized to. You think, holy shit, my group, my country is doing a current conflict that has literally never happened before in the entire history of humanity. I feel really fucking guilty about that. I'm probably going to push my government to engage in reparations. Reparations for current conflicts are the ones that matter the most, and for all the reasons Rhys provides you. Second response, IR and domestic politics don't function based on who has the best justifications. Realpolitik and individual group selfishness dominate. I don't care who can point to the most parchments that say one thing or another. I'm not taking any more POIs. Third response, you will be so horrified by the never before seen wars that you won't even bother trying to cook justifications at all on our side for all the reasons Rhys provided for you. You'll just go, holy shit, this is terrible. We need to stop it because of how we are going to unlock the power of human empathy. Third thing I want to discuss is they say art, and that will be seen as only for the elites or whatever. Nice. Minorities make art that isn't just about large-scale conflicts. They make art about a wide range of things that are involved in the human experience. Also, cross-apply all of Rhys's art way. I don't care very much. Okay, this brings me nicely to our case. We explained to you two main reasons for why it is that we are going to we're going to make the entire globe absolutely and fundamentally desperate to stop these large-scale conflicts. Voters and politicians are like. The two main reasons for one, we're going to completely get rid of the desensitization to large-scale conflicts that exist in the status quo. And two, we're going to create massive existential fear because you won't know whether these never before seen conflicts will spiral into global collapse and get everyone involved, a la World War I. I know you won't have World War I as a reference point, but still, you will literally have no idea how bad things can get with these large-scale wars. So everyone is going to be hyper-fixated on stopping them, not only for moral reasons, but also for pragmatic selfish reasons. We thus unlock the power of empathy and create strong multinational enforcement systems that ensure that these conflicts are stopped in their infancy, or if they're already beginning, they're brought as expeditiously of an end as possible. Because we have the capacity to stop conflicts. The question is just, are people willing to make sacrifices? Are people willing to make concessions? Are people willing to, as a country, willing to give up some sovereignty to join a multinational organization that has the capacity to send peacekeepers anywhere? The problem with the status quo is they simply aren't. We ensure that countries have the will and individuals have the willingness to make the extraordinary sacrifices that are necessary to create a peaceful world. And only on our side do you stop the bleeding, do you stop the dying, do you stop the culture loss, do you stop all of the harms that matter far more than every other impact in this debate. Thank you.